Can we write any histories of the past? And if so, how? That is a serious issue, and we must take them seriously, and I do, despite my disagreement with them on many points. Now, the issue of history, then, is one that I want to deal with in these lectures, and I want to show you how we can at least write a prolegomenon to the history of ancient Israel. It's not the history that my teachers would have envisioned. It's a different kind of history, but it's an important one all the same. Now, that leads me to ask then, finally, what is it that archaeology can do? If we are going to try to contribute to writing histories, better histories, more satisfactory histories of the religion of ancient Israel. First of all, archaeology gives context to the biblical stories. I remember my father, who was a clergyman, he used to say a text without a context is a pretext. And in archaeology, it's the context that tells us everything. If you rip an artifact out of context, it becomes a curiosity, a museum piece. It's not going to tell you anything. You have to put it back in its original social and economic and religious context to allow it to tell you something. So, first of all, archaeology provides a context that you will not have from the Bible itself. And it's that context that gives meaning. I like to stress that often the Bible seems to float in the air somehow. It's about very grand, eternal ideas. I remind my undergraduate students the Bible is not history, it's His story. It's the story of God's dealings with His people. It's all quite grandiose. Archaeology is about everyday life, about ordinary people. It is about real people in a real time and a real place, like us. And the biblical writers just aren't interested in ordinary folk at all. Hadn't met any of them, wouldn't have liked them. So what archaeology does is to complement the biblical stories, which comprise a kind of an intellectual history, with the history of the ordinary affairs of everyday people. And that's important, context. Not only that, but archaeology is an independent witness to the events of the past. If you have only the biblical stories, then you have no way of confirming any of them. You just take them at face value. You believe what the Bible says. These things really did happen in this way, and that's it. I always loved the bumper sticker in Tucson, mostly on the back of pickup trucks, the ones with the rifle rack in the back window. And it says, God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. So if that's the way you look at it, then you don't need archaeology. You just pick up the Bible and read it. But of course, you'll read it selectively. So you have then only the independent witness of the texts themselves. Archaeology steps out into the larger world and takes a different view, sometimes a complementary view, sometimes a contradictory view, but a view that you cannot ignore. Now, for 20 years, I've been arguing that archaeology constitutes a primary source for history writing, not a secondary source. Only recently have scholars, biblical scholars, begun to acknowledge that. A book just appeared just a few days ago by Lester Grabe, a British scholar who heads the European Seminar for Method, a rather skeptical group. His book is entitled Ancient Israel, What Do We Know and How Do We Know It? I wrote to Lester and I said, I don't know whether to be flattered or indignant, because that borrows on the title of my 2001 book, what did the biblical writers know, and when did they know it? What archaeology can tell us about the reality of ancient Israel. But Grabe has no hesitation in saying, I think for the first time, what we archaeologists have been saying all along. Archaeology constitutes now our primary source. Why? Because the biblical texts are all much later than the events they describe. They're all written from a secondary, not an eyewitness point of view. They're not contemporary. They're not authored. We don't know the names of any of the biblical authors. Archaeology is an eyewitness contemporary report. That artifact in the ground, when we first touch it, has been there for several thousand years and has not been touched or edited by anybody. It's a pristine source of new facts about the ancient world. The Bible is a closed canon. There will be no more books. We have what we have. The text is what it is. That's all. I actually left biblical studies because I thought it was sort of coming to a dead end. Archaeology is dynamic, ever expanding, continually open. We know today at least 50 times what we knew when I was a graduate student. It's astounding. And we're only in the infancy of archaeological exploration and discovery. So we have in archaeology an ever-expanding new source of information, another window through which to view the biblical world from an independent perspective. Now, however, I must caution you that archaeology does not answer all the questions. I can tell you as an archaeologist often what happened. I can tell you when it happened within a very few years. I can tell you precisely where. I can probably describe how it happened, but I cannot tell you what these events mean. That is a question for theologians and philosophers, the question of meaning. So we have to separate very clearly between these two quests. But in the end, we have to get them together, because what we believe should in some way correspond with things that really did happen. In other words, the ancient writers tell you a story. It may not be true in every detail. They don't hesitate to embellish, and maybe even now and then to invent a little bit. But basically, they believe the story is true, but that's not their motive. Their motive is to tell you what these events mean for the life of faith. Now, at that point, you see, the archaeologist steps aside. That's as far as I can go. You will have to decide for yourself what these events mean. I cannot tell you. I may have my personal view, but that's not a professional view, and it's not one that I need to share with anyone. In other words, faith is faith. It is risk. It is not secure knowledge. We will never know everything we want to know about the past. But in my judgment, we can know enough to have some respect for the biblical writers and their view of things. Ernest Wright once said in his little book, God Who Acts, Biblical Theology as Recital, a book that I discovered in seminary, which really led me into graduate studies. He said, quote, in biblical faith, everything depends upon whether the events, the original events, actually happened. That's a dangerous stance. And fundamentalists will say, of course, they all happened. And Wright was no fundamentalist. He was a critical scholar, though a churchman and a man of faith. But the question is, did anything happen in the past? Anything we can really know? And does it matter? Does it make any difference? Why should one bother to study the remote past of this tiny, obscure little corner of the world? Nothing happened there that matters to us today. Well, I don't believe that, obviously. And I want to suggest in these lectures exactly what we can and cannot know. And so be prepared for the fact that we shall question conventional wisdom regularly throughout these lectures. But at the same time, I want to take a kind of positive approach, salvaging what we can from the biblical text and showing you how archaeology can illuminate these texts powerfully. That is the real genius of archaeology, and I'm still confident. In other words, if we're going to write history, we need to raise the question of what kind of history it is that we want to write. And when you say, can we write history, you have to specify. I want to suggest in closing some kinds of history that we archaeologists are toying with, and increasingly biblical scholars perhaps as well. In other words, what kind of history do we want, and what is possible? First of all, there's a kind of narrative history, or what we could call a history of events, which is largely descriptive. It's presumed to be factual, but it's selective, and it doesn't attempt to be explanatory. It's a story about the past in narrative form, presumably based on reality. The Hebrew Bible attempts to deal with that kind of history, in part. Secondly, there's what I like to call political history, or the stories of the deeds of great men and public events. This is, of course, elitist and chauvinistic. It's episodic, it's propagandist, but it's a kind of history that's been much practiced. Certainly the Bible is political history, if it's any kind of history at all. Now out of favor, but that's what the Bible is. Third, there's a kind of broader socioeconomic history, or a history of society and societal institutions, including, of course, the economic basis of these institutions, the histories of families and clans and tribes and social classes, what Marx called the mode of production, the means of production, and above all, the history of the state and of state institutions. This is the kind of broader history that archaeology sometimes aspires to write, although it often lacks the data. Fourth is intellectual history, or the history of ideas and the context of ideas and their evolution, in particular religious ideas and religious institutions. The growth of literary traditions about religion, in other words, texts. Certainly the Bible attempts to write this kind of intellectual history. It is primarily a history of ideas rather than the realities of ancient Israel. The Bible is a story of what Israel should have been like and would have been like had the elitists who wrote it been in charge. but they never were. And so the real Israel is often quite different from the ideal portrait in the intellectual history in the Bible, and I'll show you how later. And then fifth, I would argue there is something called cultural history, which archaeologists have always tried to write. This is larger, it's contextual, it's evolutionary. It's largely the history of settlement types and patterns and distributions, demography, questions of subsistence, food systems, diet, social economic organization, and what we call today ethnicity, the archaeology of peoples in this larger sense of cultural history over long periods of time. Archaeology is particularly well equipped to write this kind of cultural history and always has attempted to do so. One of the questions today is, can we specify who these peoples were? And there's a great deal of skepticism about whether we can say anything, for instance, about the ancient Israelites, but I'll show you that we can. And then, of course, there's technological history, for which archaeology is superbly equipped. In other words, the history of human transformations of nature through technological innovation, or what we might call the preconditions of civilization. We can write a history of things, a history of technology and technological changes in ways the biblical writers are just not interested in at all. And then there's something I would call material history, as I've said earlier, or history from things, and it treats artifacts as what we will call material correlates of behavior. What the archaeologist wants to do is not just look at the thing, but to look at the person who produced the thing, and then to try to get at the thoughts and intentions in the minds of the maker, and then to put all of that in a larger cultural context that gives it meaning. That's very ambitious, but at its best we are able to do it. And then eighth, there is something we could call simply natural history, something that Pliny, for instance, tried in his De Rerum Naturae, or the ecological approach today. In other words, the history of the natural environment and of changes over long periods of time, of culture as adaptation to nature. And here again, we archaeologists are well suited to write such history. And finally, very attractive to historians today is something popularized by Fernand Braudel and others, the so-called Annales school of history, which tries to look at something called in French la longue durée, the very long duration, looking not only at episodic events here and there at one or another facts or a short period of time, but at the long swell of history over the ages. Archaeologists are now attempting to do that kind of history, though it requires enormous documentation. Now, text, including the biblical text, can contribute to all these kinds of histories, some better than others. But archaeology is well equipped, better equipped, in fact, to deal with some of these histories. So what I want to try to suggest in these lectures is simply this: history matters, and it matters a great deal. There are facts. Some facts are very important, and it is those facts we want to try to get at. With confidence, with courage, with honesty, not afraid of our own doubts. In my long career as an archaeologist, I have never discovered anything I wish I had covered up. Again, you have to deal with it and with what it means, and it raises new questions. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot turn the clock back. We cannot go back to a pre-modern understanding of the Bible. It was good enough for our ancestors and the founding fathers. It will not do today. Unless we can make the Bible relevant in a real sense, with a real history behind it, in 25 years, nobody will read the Bible anymore. I think that would be a loss. And so what I want to urge you is to join me in a task, a daunting task, of trying to read the Bible in the light of all the new information we have now from archaeology. I have no fears. We will see how this turns out.